Anthropic is sitting on what it says is its most powerful AI model yet, and it still hasn't released it to the general public. The name of this model is Claude Mythos, and in this video, I'm going to be breaking down exactly what it is, what's been happening in the news recently surrounding this model, and what I think are the future implications of this model's existence. Some of what I'm covering here comes directly from Anthropic's own documents, some of it comes from tech reporting, and some of it comes from leaks and developer sleuthing, which hasn't officially been confirmed by Anthropic. I'll tell you which is which as we go along, so you know what to take at face value and what to treat as a strong signal, but not necessarily a complete fact. All right, let's get into it. All right, let's get started by walking through what Claude Mythos actually is. So it's essentially just another model that Anthropic is developing. Let's go over quickly what are the other models that it currently has so we can kind of put into context, right? So you're more familiar with these probably, right? We got Claude Haiku, we got Sonnet, and we got Opus. Haiku is it's the quick model. It's fast and cheap. It's good for getting quick answers. Sonnet is better for everyday tasks, right? It combines intelligence with speed. And then Opus it's currently the smartest model that Anthropic has released right now. It's most generally available for complex reasoning and doing agentic coding, doing research online, all that stuff, right? So these are the three models that are currently released right now, and where Mythos sits is actually a level above Opus in terms of capabilities. And so Anthropic describes it as its most capable frontier model to date, and it sits above Opus in many internal evaluations so far. So let's jump into quantifying actually how much better Mythos is than its predecessors, right? So we're going to be comparing it compared to Opus 4.6. You can see here there's a lot of different benchmark tests that Anthropic ran internally, comparing the Mythos preview against Opus 4.6 in terms of a bunch of different categories, right? We have agentic coding, we have reasoning, and we have agentic search and computer use. And you can see here Mythos kind of sweeps Opus in all of these areas. So you can see here Software Engineering Bench Pro. This is essentially just an AI evaluation framework which tests LLMs and autonomous agents on real-world software engineering tasks. And you can see here that Mythos pretty much sweeps Opus 4.6 on Software Engineering Bench Pro. And then a lot of other common agentic coding benchmark tests, it's performing a lot better. So obviously we can see here there's a huge gap between what's currently out there right now, available to the public, and what Mythos promises to offer. Also going into reasoning, you can see here the GPQA Diamond. GPQA essentially stands for Graduate Level Google Proof Q&A Benchmark. Right? It's a highly difficult data set that is used to test and evaluate advanced reasoning and problem-solving capabilities of artificial intelligence models, LLMs, etc. Right? And it's actually considered one of the leading barometers to measure reasoning for LLMs. And so you can see here GPQA Diamond, Mythos is performing a little bit better than Opus 4.6 in terms of this test, right? But it's performing substantially better on these other reasoning exams as well. So already Mythos is sweeping agentic coding and reasoning compared to Anthropic's earlier models. If we take a look at agentic search and computer use, this is basically just web scraping. You can see here BrowseComp. It's an open source benchmark created by OpenAI to measure and test web browsing capabilities of AI agents. And you can see here Mythos is performing better than Opus 4.6 in this category as well, and also OSWorld verified, which is another agentic search and computer use benchmark test. You can see here just how much breadth Mythos has of capability over Opus 4.6 in general. And this should give you kind of an idea of how powerful this model is. All right, so while all of this has been happening in the background, Anthropic packages Claude Mythos under this project called Project Glasswing. Now, Project Glasswing was released on April 7th of this year, and the idea behind it is that Claude Mythos is so powerful that if it were to get into the hands of some bad actors, they could potentially use Claude Mythos to plan a cybersecurity attack against some critical infrastructure, to hack some sort of software. Claude Mythos is so powerful, as you can see in agentic coding and also in cybersecurity vulnerability reproduction, that it would be able to pretty much cause a lot of havoc in terms of the tech community and towards targeted attacks on certain critical softwares that we run a lot of applications on today. And so what Anthropic is trying to do with Project Glasswing is essentially give Mythos to a select group of companies which control a lot of infrastructure that's happening in the world today, right? So that includes your Microsoft, that includes AWS, includes certain governmental organizations, right? They're basically giving Claude Mythos to these higher up entities so they can use Mythos to fortify their own infrastructure before they release a sample to the public for general use, right? And it makes sense. You don't want to necessarily release the most powerful AI model to the populace before you do some internal refactoring to make sure no one can really break any of the critical infrastructure that our society runs on. So that's the main premise of Glasswing, just essentially to have a controlled release of Claude Mythos and to manage it in terms of how it's going to be implemented into different aspects of society. And this doc kind of goes over what Project Glasswing is essentially. So this is Anthropic's official briefing. And these are some of the companies that Anthropic is currently working with as part of Project Glasswing. So you can see here there's some pretty important infrastructure companies here like CrowdStrike, We got AWS, which is what a lot of software companies run on. We got Apple, JP Morgan, NVIDIA. Okay, so it's releasing it to these high-profile companies to be able to help them fortify their infrastructure, find critical cybersecurity flaws, and fix them. Now, the pricing for these partners is pretty interesting, right? For early access, the pricing is sitting around $25 per million input tokens and $125 per million output tokens. Right? And for reference, Opus runs on around $15 per million output tokens. So this is significantly more expensive, as you can see, and obviously not aimed at the average user, right? It's aimed more towards these enterprise companies who can afford this level of token usage and who actually might need it right now. And just to give a quick idea of one of the early examples of how Claude Mythos has actually helped solve some security flaws. Over here, we can see that Mythos Preview found a 27-year-old vulnerability in OpenBSD, which itself has a reputation as one of the most security-hardened operating systems in the world. So the fact that Mythos is able to find a bug this old in such a long-standing and reputable operating system like OpenBSD is pretty insane. And it makes you think, what other security vulnerabilities are there in common softwares that we use these days, right? Are there any security vulnerabilities in AWS that need to be addressed before this model gets released to the public? Is there anything in some critical cybersecurity softwares that are used by a lot of large enterprise companies that might need to be addressed before releasing this model? And so a lot of questions here to think about. These are some examples of bugs that Mythos has found so far. If you want to read more about this, I'll drop the link to this preview inside the description of this video. But yeah, some pretty interesting stuff over here. All right, now that was Project Glasswing. Now what's interesting is that just last week, Anthropic released another article over here called Project Glasswing, an initial update. Basically, they're giving an update on how the project has been going with all of their partner organizations. And something that's pretty interesting to see here is that the Claude Mythos preview, out of the 50 partners that they've used, or out of the 50 partners that they've tested it on, has been able to find more than 10,000 high or critical severity vulnerabilities across the most important software in the world. So basically, Claude Mythos was able to find a bunch of critically severe vulnerabilities that could have been exploited by malicious actors had Mythos been put into the wrong hands. So this is very smart what they're doing, right? They're having a little controlled release to these partners, giving them time to fortify their infrastructure before releasing Claude Mythos. But this is kind of crazy, This is a lot of security vulnerabilities. If you think about how many engineers are hired, how many very smart engineers are hired by these companies, this is a lot of stuff that Claude Mythos is actually unveiling, and it just goes to show how powerful this model is at determining these vulnerabilities and how much of an asset it is for cybersecurity in general as we move forward. And you can see here, even with companies such as Cloudflare, which are famed for their cybersecurity, it was able to find 2,000 bugs, 400 of which are high or critical severity, right? Which is absolutely insane. 2,000 bugs is a pretty crazy amount. The fact that Claude Mythos was able to find this many in a software as robust as Cloudflare is pretty crazy. One other quick reference that I'll bring up that Claude Mythos was able to detect was that it was able to detect in WolfSSL, which is a widely known open source cryptography library that is very well known for its security, and it's currently used in billions of devices worldwide. But Mythos was able to actually construct an exploit which would let an attacker forge certificates to allow them to host a fake website for a bank or email provider, right? And then the website would look perfectly legitimate to an end user, but be controlled by the attacker, right? So as you can see, there's a bunch of different things that Mythos is unveiling right now. Super powerful model. Those are just a few of the many security flaws that were reported in this initial update for Project Glasswing, right? And throughout this initial update, a big thing that Anthropic is pointing to is the fact that, it's unveiling all of these security flaws. And right now the bottleneck isn't necessarily the unveiling of the security flaws, it's more of just the timeline of which it'll take to patch all of these, right? There's 10,000 that it was able to identify just from this first initial pass. And, obviously it's not gonna be an overnight thing where they just fix this. And so the big bottleneck here right now, according to Anthropic, is that they need to spend time fixing all of these flaws, making sure that the critical infrastructure that runs our society is robust enough to handle a model of this scale being released to the general public. Now, I want to call out an interesting thing that a lot of people don't talk about here, and it's the wording that Anthropic has placed on Claude Mythos' rollout, right? So down here, Anthropic, under this Project Glasswing announcement, specifically states that they do not plan to make Claude Mythos Preview generally available, but their initial goal, or their eventual goal, is to enable their users to safely deploy Mythos class models at scale for cybersecurity purposes, right? Their users being the enterprise companies that they're currently rolling it out to. Now, this was their stance. What is this from? Like April, I believe, right? This was from early April. Okay, the date's not here, but take my word for it. Okay, this is from early April. They mentioned this about a month ago, that they would not make it available to general users, right? Now, over here in their initial update, what is interesting is that, let me see if I can find the actual wording over here. So they say here, in the near future, once we've developed the far stronger safeguards that they need, they look forward to making Mythos class models available through a general release. So they did a complete 180 versus their initial talk here about not making it available for the general public, to now having it, potentially be available in the near future, which is a complete shift in their wording from just last month. And not a lot of people bring this up. I think it's pretty interesting how they've been shifting their stance on the severity of Mythos, especially after it found all of these security flaws. And, obviously Cloudflare and a lot of these companies like Mozilla, the UK, they have a lot of work to do to be able to fortify their software to be ready for the Mythos rollout. But it's interesting that they're mentioning this in a post, in a article like this, where they're talking about all the security flaws that it's unveiling. So just something to think about on the general direction that this Mythos release is heading towards. We could be getting a public release of Mythos in the very near future, according to Anthropic's official statements over here. Now, kind of to back that up, what's pretty interesting that I noticed among the tech community recently is that there have been a bunch of leaks of Claude Mythos, being briefly available here and there in certain softwares. And so here I am on Testing Catalog, pretty reputable AI news and rumors outlet. And they have over here just, you can see here Mythos 1 extended as showing as like a preview in this person's Claude desktop app, right? And apparently some users were able to temporarily see the Mythos 1 model in the UI. Okay, so, and not just here as well. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with Google Vertex. Essentially what Google Vertex is it's Google Cloud's end-to-end artificial intelligence and machine learning platform. Basically helps developers and businesses with providing a unified enterprise-grade environment to build, test, and deploy AI models, AI agents, chatbots, all that stuff. It has access to, I'll actually open up my own Google Cloud or Google Vertex instance. It actually has access to a bunch of different models through its model garden. You can see we have access to Grok, Kimi, DeepSeek. Obviously, we have Claude over here. We have Gemini. So, in Google Vertex, you have access to a bunch of these models. You can test them out. But what's interesting is that just last week, people were posting some interesting little tidbits about how Claude Mythos was actually available in Google Vertex. Now, Claude Mythos Preview has been available in Google Vertex since April 7th. But what's interesting is that you can see here, this base model Claude Mythos tag isn't the Claude Mythos Preview tag, right? This is the actual base model for Claude Mythos that was found inside of Google Vertex. And so that's pretty interesting. There's a lot of discussion here on the validity of this, but there have been a few multiple sources that have references. Obviously, this isn't from official Anthropic documentation or announcement, so I'll take it with a grain of salt. But, there's multiple sources here that are talking about essentially Mythos 1 being released, some of them more reputable than others. Just makes you think that combined with this idea here that Anthropic is placing, that in the near future, they'll be releasing Mythos class models to the general public. Just something to think about, food for thought. It might be closer than we may initially have thought earlier. All right, so what does this mean if you're building out AI agents, AI workflows for businesses, if you're an AI consultant? My take on it is that this is a pretty big opportunity for security in particular, right? The biggest thing that people are talking about with Claude Mythos right now is the security aspect of it, how it's good for fortifying cybersecurity, good for figuring out security flaws in software, et cetera, et cetera. And so obviously if you're an AI agency or an AI consultancy building out AI solutions for businesses, security is a big aspect of that, right? Let's say you're building out an operations dashboard for a business to help them track their revenue, to help them track their sales pipeline, all that stuff. You're building out this dashboard for them, which is drawing from a bunch of different softwares. There's a lot of room for security vulnerabilities in that if you don't know what you're doing. And so the agencies and consultancies that will be able to leverage Mythos to fortify their clients' software that they're developing for them. If you're a vibe coder and don't necessarily have all of the background in cybersecurity and software engineering that maybe someone more seasoned in the profession might have, or even if you are, right, and you just need to double check your work to make sure that the software that you're developing is actually robust enough for a production level deployment, then I can see Claude Mythos being a very helpful tool, just helping you cross-reference your work, making sure that it's not vulnerable to security flaws. I think it's definitely something that perhaps an agency or consultancy could offer in the future as kind of part of a retainer service, right? regular security reviews using Claude Mythos, or regular updates on the latest Mythos models if you're acting as a consultancy, consulting your clients on which Mythos class models to use to analyze security flaws. All this, there's a lot of different stuff you can do with security in terms of the retainer packages that you're offering to your clients, as well as just general implementation best practices. And so I think Mythos is great for AI agencies and AI consultancies in the future. That's my take on it. I think in general it'll be helpful to help fortify your offer, essentially. Make sure that clients know that they're getting a quality software solution and not just some vibe coded slop. Right? There's also something interesting here in terms of the pricing, right? As I mentioned before, Claude Mythos, even for the Claude Mythos preview that's happening right now for these around 50 or so companies that Project Glasswing is targeting, they're paying a lot of money per million tokens used for access to this Mythos model, right? Obviously, these are large enterprise companies. They can front the cost. But when you think about small to medium-sized businesses that might not necessarily have all the budget to be able to run a dedicated Claude Mythos instance to analyze their code, there's some interesting things you can do there in terms of your retainer package, right? You could potentially eat up the cost of Claude Mythos and offer a custom payment plan to your clients to automate a monthly, quarterly review of their software, something like that. There's a lot of different pricing plans you can play around with this. I think just in general, the pricing aspect of Claude Mythos is an interesting segue or an interesting thing to explore as an AI agency or as an AI consultancy, right? But bottom line here is that Mythos isn't just another, just your average model upgrade. It seems almost as if it's its own class of AI model in a sense, right? It's performing so much better in these benchmark tests compared to its predecessors, and it's being considered for a lot of different use cases, right? Claude Code is mostly considered, for software engineering coding, but it seems like Claude Mythos is being, for the most part, focused on the security aspect. That's where the highest leverage is for Mythos, at least from what we've seen from what Anthropic has released in terms of Project Glasswing. And so in general, takeaway from this is just the model release might be closer than a lot of us think. Definitely keep your eyes out for latest news on Claude Mythos. I know I will be, and I'll be, keeping you guys up to date with that as best as I can. But something interesting to think about, something interesting to consider. Yeah, if you found this useful, hit the like and subscribe button down below. It helps a lot. I'll be dropping a few links to the resources that I use in this video inside the description below as well, so you can take a look at those. And if you want updates on the latest that's happening in AI right now, the latest news that's happening, the latest use cases, I have a school community, which I'll link below, where I drop a bunch of different guides inside of our AI newsroom to keep you guys up to date with the latest that's happening. Yeah, I'll see you guys in the next video. Cheers.